Yours too, Harvey.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to our BBL today. My name is Harvey, and I'm a senior fellow at the Lee Kuan Yew Center for Innovative Cities, and I'll be chairing the session today. We are very pleased to welcome our speaker for today, Professor Tim Stonor, who is a practicing architect, urban planner, researcher, as well as consultant, wearing multiple hats. And today he's going to talk to us about I guess a very important question that will define the cities of the future, which is the topic of digital design, especially how we can make use of technology to create new urban spaces that will help us live better in the future. So I think without further ado, I will invite Professor Stonor to begin his seminar.
Thank you, Harvey, and good afternoon, everyone in the room and joining online. It's a pleasure to be back. I think it was 8 years that have passed since I was last here. And what I'd like to do today is talk about the city as a transaction machine in addressing those issues that Harvey set out. What is at the heart of my talk, and what is at the heart, I think, of cities, is the transactions between people that create the ideas that drive our societies. And as an architect and as an urban planner, that's what really fascinates me. How, when we're thinking about the future of cities, can we think first about the people in them and their needs before we then start thinking about the buildings that house those people, which is often where architects move straight to, or the trees that shade the streets that the landscape designers might provide, or the vehicles that might move people from A to B that the transport planners often think first about. How do we think before any of that about people and their transactions? So that's the subject of the talk, during which I want to describe the space syntax approach to urban planning and building design. And in doing so, let me summarize it at the beginning in 2 slides. There are 2 things that really matter to us at space syntax. And the first is the everyday behavior of people, which we look at in the long tradition of human observation. We look at through direct observations, either having people sitting in public space and watching and counting, or filming or recording with drones. But the first key input to our approach is the behavior of people. And this builds on that tradition that it's started with the likes of William White in the US, Jane Jacobs then writing very much in line with William White about those seemingly insignificant everyday conversations between people, actions in public space, but taken collectively become massively, powerfully important to the ways that cities work and the consequences for the economics and the environment of cities. And then the second key interest at space syntax is digital. How can we use the power of digital modeling to capture those human behaviors, to understand them, and then to predict what might happen when we change the physical and spatial form of cities? And we come at this as architects, as urban planners, as urban designers and landscape designers, but equally, some of my colleagues are archaeologists, and they do the opposite. They try to go back in history when what they can see in the ground is a spatial and physical layout. How can they interpolate the social structures that might have been there to occupy those spatial layouts? So it's a very multidisciplinary approach. The space syntax approach was pioneered by Bill Hillier when he joined UCL in the early 1970s. And we're very close to 50 years now of continuous theoretical and methodological development. And Bill and then his colleagues at UCL were equally interested in the social as the digital. And maybe I don't need to emphasize it too many more times in this lecture, but space syntax sometimes has a reputation with the digital, with mapping, with algorithms and analytics. That's 50%. The other 50% is the human to this. Now, where we are taking that approach is something that I also want to talk about at the beginning, because our activities are guided by interests and guided by emergencies. And there are three that I want to list here. Purpose really matters to us. What is the purpose? Why do we do what we do? I think that's the question that we should all be asking in our practice. And for us, it's climate, the climate emergency. How can we design cities to address that, truly address that, not just talk about it, but do it? The health emergency, and in particular, the twin emergencies of obesity and loneliness, physical health, mental health. And then the third driver, the emergency of shelter, including unplanned informal settlements, the displaced peoples of the world, I believe, exceeding 100 million people at present for the first time. These are the three emergencies that direct our activities, which are often manifest in the traffic jam. If I can just be for a moment focused on this, because the traffic jam, traffic congestion, has become an internationally consistent badge of the failings of 20th century planning. And the health impacts of polluted air, the health impacts of sedentary behavior, people sitting in cars, the physical impact of that, the lack of exercise, and the mental impact of being frustrated and then coming home and taking out that frustration on the people around you are the real products of failed 20th century modes of planning. So I just want to explore those a little before we can see some alternatives. How could we think differently? How can we innovate in the way that we put cities together? Were there more people in the room? I might do a straw poll to name that city, but maybe you could name it already. Does anyone know where we are? Just in the room here. There's no prize. There's no punishment for getting it wrong. No one's brave enough to name. It's Beijing, but it sort of could have been anywhere. It could have been anywhere, and that's the point. We keep building these things. We can't keep building failed cities, is the point I want to make. The future is very definitely cities. What we need to do, though, is make sure that we have better cities, because the cities that we're creating are not working. United Nations figures, these figures are already 12 years old, but I think we all know them. The global population is increasing, the urban population is increasing, but it's the last two sets on the right there that worry me and fascinate me. The informal urban population, people living in slums, is expected to increase threefold. And at the same time, the middle class is expected to increase, not by quite the same amount, but not far off. So we have increased inequality. We've got many, many more poor people living fragile lives, and we've got many more people with wealth who are probably going to be buying cars, and eating meat. And those two emblems of wealth are going to make the situation even worse. So we have to do something differently. We can't just keep doing what we've been doing. Let's look at what we've been doing and what we used to do in this slide, because this gives us our first urban challenge. The first urban challenge is that fast highways have replaced main streets in our cities. Fast highways on the left. Again, I could say, can you name the city on the left? I'd be really surprised if anyone could, but you might see a city you know somewhere in there. It happens to be a city in the Middle East. And the city on the right, yeah, it's Paris. It's Paris. It's Paris. We knew it was Europe. We knew it was a famous street because it's in our collective memory. The street on the left, dominated by vehicles, the buildings that line, I'm not going to call it a street, the road, the highway on the left, lined by buildings that turn their front door away. They face the street at the back. And property values in the city on the left are lowest next to the highway, and they get higher the further away you get from the highway. And on the right, on the Champs-Élysées in Paris, property values are the highest next to the street. And the buildings face the street at ground level with shops and galleries and clubs and studios, and people live and work above. These are two completely different typologies. And the question, I think, for all of us is which one should the future of the planet be based around? Because we know in Paris on the right, I mean, this is an old photograph. The Champs-Élysées is being transformed even further away from the vehicle. And people, you can see the pedestrians. There are as many pedestrians as vehicles on the Champs-Élysées. There will be even more pedestrians after they transform that street to slow speed, 30 kilometers, 20 miles an hour driving. This is the direction that Paris is taking, but it's not the direction that every city around the planet is taking, and that is really worrying. That is not going to help address the emergencies that we set out at the beginning. Why is this? Well, I think architects and planners have been and continue to be hugely influenced by the Plan Voisin. Any French speakers in the room? The French word voisin, it means neighbor. And I was fooled for decades thinking that Le Corbusier's thinking behind the Plan Voisin was that it was the neighborly plan. It was the neighborhood plan, the plan to promote neighborliness. It certainly sounds like it. But then you look at it, it's a series of highways in between which sit separate tower blocks surrounded by landscape but divided by roads. This was the model created in the 1920s that is continuing to be built worldwide as the international standard, supported by insurance companies, supported by international banks, as being the best, most viable product of urbanism. And it's creating all of those problems. So we need to do things differently. So voisin does not mean neighborhood in this case, it means automobile. The Voisin automobile, created by the Limousin Voisin company, was the sponsor of this plan. It was deliberately designed to sell cars. That's the Plan Voisin. And I think when you know that, everything then makes sense. This, in fact, is Le Corbusier's own Voisin that he drove. Shall I just admit people when they appear on the screen?
Yes, I'm so sorry.
I'm happy to multitask.
Sorry, I need to move this up, but I'm not very good with my right hand, so maybe you do it.
I can try.
Yeah. Okay.
I think we're a little there. There we are. That's better.
I tried to do my left-hander, so we can't do it very well.
So I think this raises the challenge: who should be the sponsor of the next plan for cities, which is not about driving, but it's about not only about driving, but it's about walking, and it's about slow speed mobility. It's not going to be an automobile company, I don't think. its consequences were not just the unbuilt project in Paris, but, as I said, the international standard in city design, and not only in city centres, but in the suburbs. This is the suburb of Skelmersdale, or as I say here, or anywhere, produced by British planners, British architects. It's a system of highways, if you look carefully, highways where you can drive up to, I think, 50 or 60 or 70 miles an hour. And then small fragmented blocks of urbanism, disconnected from each other by landscape. And here's the challenge. There's so much landscape in this plan that the landscape assessment might say that this is a hugely positive, beneficial, carbon sequestering environment. Here's the question, is that enough? If what that is doing, as we know it is doing, is making it difficult for people to leave their home and get their children to school, walk to the shops, if it means that most families here have one car, so that when one of the parents drives to work, and the other parent is left at home, reliant on an informal transportation network, informal taxi system. This is the UK, globally wealthy nation, with an informal transportation network supporting a fragile mental health society. The product of planning, the product of poor planning influenced by Le Corbusier, but sold as landscape. This is the challenge. Now, what could we set against it? Well, cities that were built before the automobile are a good place to start looking. So yes, and we've talked about international comparisons of city performance in the 21st century in Southeast Asia and elsewhere. I think equally, let's look at history and try to backcast how these cities might have performed in terms of at least their mobility. We know problems of sanitation, problems of water supply and waste removal, and I'm not trying to deny that a city like Florence would not have had its problems, but it was and it is eminently walkable and hugely attractive and hugely appealing, and the creator of great wealth and great cultural value. This, to me, is the kind of city that we should be looking to create more of, rather than building more highway and consigning more people to sedentary and lonely lifestyles. What does that mean? Well, in simple diagrammatic terms, it means moving away from the fragmented city on the left to the integrated city of continuously connected neighborhoods on the right. And then designing the detail of those cities to deliver the sophistication of a place like La Rambla in Barcelona. A street which mixes both walking down the middle and driving down the edges. It's hard to see the vehicles, but they are there if you look to the sides of the screen. You can drive and you can walk. You can scooter, you can take a car. And then an exquisite landscape. Those trees are magnificent, just enough for the European heat to take the edge off the summer heat. And at ground level, a continuously fronted ground story of shops and businesses, gallery studios, above which people live or work. This is a model of urban design delivery. What's actually going on in those streets then is my next observation. If we can see a great street and a great buzz like La Rambla, what's actually happening in there? And this is where my research colleagues, the ethnographers, the human behavior scientists help unpack what those incremental little mini behaviors are. And there's 8 that I've drawn up here that collectively create what we call the urban buzz. The urban buzz, you know it when it's there. You know it when you're in a street that feels, you can hear it as well. You can sometimes hear a great public space before you come upon it. You walk through the streets of, say, a city like Madrid, You hear it around the corner. You're hearing the urban buzz. It's people coming together and doing everyday stuff, beginning with presence, people being present, choosing to be in a city. That's a choice because not everyone makes it, but presence leads to co-presence because you're not the only one who's made the choice. You are in the presence of other people. Even before anything else happens, simply being on a street with other people creates a feeling. And it's usually a positive feeling. If it's late at night and there's one other person, it might be a negative feeling. You might feel threatened. But when you're in the presence of 2, 3, or 4 other people, it is generally beneficial. Then communication takes place. It might just be a nod. It might just be a wave. It could be to a complete stranger. That's a good test of a good city. Do people say good morning to each other? And not every city they do, but go to many places and people will say good morning. That's a good test. You know, we can count lots of things, but I think the good morning test is a good thing to be measuring. At some point, there might be an interaction, number 4. That's a conversation. That's a conversation between perhaps friends. What then gets interesting is number 5, those 2 people at the front there, the transaction. They just look at their eyes. There's something going on there. I could be making this up, but this photograph speaks to me. They're doing a deal. And it could be a social deal. It might be, okay, let's meet later on this evening, or it could be an economic deal. You know, maybe they're doing business, and increasingly, the street is the office, or the ground floor of the building is the office. We can talk about the future of work, and I think these sorts of streets with these sorts of interactions lead to the kinds of transactions that we're looking for in business. Number 6 is really important. That's the introduction. That's when I go with a friend to a party. My friend meets someone who they know and introduces me to someone I've never met before. And my friend might then leave us, and I'm now talking to the person I've never met before. I might not, but I might gain something in that unplanned interaction that leads to an idea that had never happened before. It might spark, and it does spark because this is the process that happens. It's these seemingly haphazard introductions that lead to 2 people working on the same thing they hadn't realized. One's taking one version of the approach, the other's taking the other version of the approach, and you end up inventing, whether it's DNA, whether it's splitting the atom. These are the interactions that occur through these introductions. And they lead to innovations. And then the city, finally, is the best place on the planet to broadcast your creation. So cities and their everyday behaviors are creating very, very powerful outcomes, which is why I like to refer to them as transaction machines. Sounds a bit engineering, but I like the idea of a machine because it allows us then to think about the machine that works well versus the machine that isn't working well. And that gets me back to where we started about cities underperforming or creating major problems. But we've had cities for 10,000 years, the archaeologists advise. It's about that. Some people think much longer. The timber tends to rot away and leave fewer marks. But we've had them for 10,000 years. For 9,900 years, they followed a very consistent pattern of an interconnected street network that was highly walkable, that had a hierarchy where you have main streets where the shops locate, and then you have side streets where people live. There are a few long, straight, highly connected streets and very many short, less connected streets. There was, in the urban record, there is a geometrical consistency to cities across cultures. What makes the difference is topography, slope, presence of water, landform, underlying geology. Those create local nuances, which makes Monaco different to Chicago. But humanistically, the way in which people shop, whether we call it Main Street or High Street or souk, tends to be linear, apart from the intersection of streets where we often find a market just either at the intersection or just behind the intersection. Usually behind the hawker market because it's been cleared from the intersection where it really wanted to be, but was getting in the way. Until 100 years ago, when the rules went out the window and we decided that we knew better and that with the car, there was an alternative. My vote goes for 9,000 years of human evolution rather than 100 years of the petrol engine if I'm looking to design the future of cities, which is where I want to go to next. Of course, there are cultural differences in the way we lay out the architecture within the city, especially domestically, and especially in the dining room. The way we eat as cultures usually defines our local cultural identity. The way we shop, really, really consistent up until 100 years ago. And then, of course, we've invented the shopping mall, and now everyone wants them. So we're getting that consistency back, but we're getting a bad version of it. So let's just turn the page a little and ask ourselves the question, how can we objectify, code, be scientific about the introductory remarks that I've made? That's our second key pursuit at Space Syntax, and it begins with graph theory. And okay, as an architect, I know a little bit about mathematics, but not much. Graph theory is not difficult. It's the way of describing the way space is laid out in buildings, and the examples here could not be simpler. So I hope I'm going to take everyone with me as I try to give a straightforward explanation of what you're looking at. Maybe you're there already, because graph theory is not difficult, but once you understand its simple form, you can understand a city. On the building on the left, there are 2 rooms, and each room connects to the outside, and there's also a doorway between the 2 rooms, between A and B. There's a doorway. A has a door to the outside, B has a door to the outside. On the right, B does not have a door to the outside, which means if you're in B and you want to go outside, you have to go through A to get out there. We can represent that plan as a graph. You'll see why in a moment. Why? Because it's going to get a little more complicated. But as a graph, the mathematicians draw an architectural plan where the rooms are the nodes and the doorways are connections between the nodes, the straight black lines. And it's a ring. The form of that graph is a ring. A, B, and C are equivalent. The number 2, is the total depth of the network from that space. So B has a value of 2 because it is 1 step away from C, 1 step away from A. And we all know 1 plus 1, most of the times, until we're philosophers, 1 plus 1 equals 2. Look at the graph on the right, and let me jump to the calculation for B. B is 1 step away from A, and it's 2 steps away from C. 1 plus 2 equals 3. So B has a value of 3. B is deeper than any other space in the network. Its number is high. Let's take this central room on the left, grayed out with 0 in the middle of it. This is our route. We're going to stand in this room and think, how does the building look from here? And we're going to draw it first of all as a plan. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 rooms that are 1 step away. There are 3 rooms that are 2 steps away, and there are 2 rooms that are 3 steps away. And we can represent that as a graph at the bottom. 1, 2, 3 steps. And then add up all of the numbers, and the total is 16. The rest of the building is 16 steps total from the room that we're standing in. Move to another room in the corner here, draw the graph, That room is 30 steps in total. There's only one room that's directly connected to it. There's two that are 2 steps away, two that are 3, 2 that are 4, 1 that's 5, and 1 that's 6. Total is 30. This number can be represented as a color. This is the next little trick, to represent the number as a color, where the smaller number is hot red and the largest number is cold blue. And I've chosen the smallest and the largest to make the point. We can apply a color and a number to each space in the room. And we've now got an objective measure of total depth from each room. Think of this house, this sequence as a house. Think of this house holding a student party. Think about where everyone ends up. There's going to be 2 groups. There's going to be the socializers, which are in the number 16. They want to maximize their interactions. And then there's going to be the people who want to get away from it all in the corner room with 30. We use buildings according to our needs, and buildings influence our needs. It's a 2-way interaction. And graph theory helps us unpack that. Move to the scale of a city, we do exactly the same thing, but this time represent the city as a sequence of lines to begin with. And these lines can be given an origin in terms of the segment between each intersection in the street. So this piece of street where my cursor is moving is a bit like the room in that house. It becomes one of our origins. And we journey from each origin to each possible destination. So the segments that are immediately adjacent are 1 step away. Turn a corner, we'll get to some that are 2. Eventually, you might get to some which are 14, 15, 16 steps away. Across a whole city, they may be hundreds of steps away. This is the point where I can't do the math and you can't do the math. We need a computer. And that's the benefit of computing, that what we do is we run an algorithm that runs all of these journeys, does it in about 10 seconds. We could do it, it would take us about a lifetime, but we can do this very, very quickly. Now, using the same principle of the colors, we can identify that there is a structure, a hierarchy, where you see the main street running from left to right, across the middle of the image. That is the most spatially accessible street in the city. And then there are radials off it, and then there are little quiet streets. And maybe you're getting ahead of me, but you're sort of imagining what you might find on those streets. And those are the questions that we then ask ourselves. In this city, what do we find on these streets? Do we find land uses of a particular kind? And we would expect in a historic city, if this is Florence, it's not, it's actually Munich. But if Munich's a historically evolved city, what do we find on those streets? Shops. What do we find on the main, hottest red street? The most expensive, most high-earning shops. What do we find on the green and the blue streets? We find people's houses. And on one of these quiet streets, you're never far from a busy street. Golden rule of a good city. Within 2 changes of direction, you can move from urban tranquility to the urban buzz in a very short distance. And that is the magic of urbanism. And it's not magic. It's the logic of a spatial network that privileges the main streets with activity and the minor streets with tranquility, but only if it's laid out simply as a connected grid of streets. Let's zoom out. Let's look at another city, which is Shanghai. I'll mention it now. Now, this is a computer model of Shanghai built only with the input of a Google map. That was all we had. We couldn't get access for obvious reasons to Chinese mapping data. So we used a Google map, or in fact, we used an OpenStreetMap, took the road center lines, cleaned them up a little, ran the algorithm. This now becomes a very powerful tool to think about mobility across the city. And we're using it in planning projects in Shanghai as a result. What we're finding when we have access to data, when we go out and count people and then compare levels of movement to levels of spatial accessibility, we find correlations again and again and again. In every town, in every city on the planet, we find correlations between the natural connectivity of streets and the amount of movement you find on them. In the historic cities, I'll come to the planned car-dependent ones in a moment, but in the historic cities, you're looking at, in fact, the correlations are for London here. On the left is pedestrian movement. Each red dot is where we've gone out. A student researcher being paid extremely well, I'm sure, for this, has counted with a clipboard and a pencil. And as I was saying earlier, it's a geospatial technology. It's just a non-digital one, clipboard and a pencil. They've counted people, taken those results back, dropped them into a statistical spreadsheet, correlated, very simple Pearson correlations, an R squared of 0.589. There is a 60% correlation between observed data set and modeled spatial connectivity. 60% of the difference in the pedestrian movement pattern of central London can be explained with the simplest of simple models, one variable, spatial accessibility. 70% of London's vehicle movement distribution. The more connected, the more movement. So we can spend, and people do spend, millions and hundreds of millions of dollars on transport modeling, often trying to explain what can be explained very, very simply if you have a spatial insight, if you have a spatial model that allows these insights to be addressed. I'm going to go on and show some applications of the model. And for me as an architect, the first application is in master planning. What fascinated me was that we could use these research findings to design the future of cities. So we can take the model of an existing location, the colors, we can add a master plan, the white lines, and we can run the model. And because the models are simple, they're quick. In a matter of seconds, we can make a movement forecast for a new spatial layout for a city. Now, the model doesn't know whether it's retail or residential or commercial at this stage. That can come later. But at this stage, it can give a reading on the spatial connectivity and the likelihood of pedestrian flow. And this one doesn't work. These flows are low. The blues indicate that we've got the wrong spatial layout, the wrong spatial design. So go back to the drawing board and create a new spatial design. Streets, in this case, that point at the site and connect through the site, and when we analyze them, generates far higher levels of spatial connectivity. This is the first step in spatial master planning. After this can come land use allocation. After this can come urban design to make sure that the bright red east-west street that we've just created doesn't become overwhelmed by vehicle traffic. We can design it for slow speed traffic, narrow lane widths, the right materials. We can create visual friction on the street through landscaping to encourage vehicles to slow down. These sorts of findings are then built on by adding other data sets to the models. So at this point, we've had a spatial model. We've added pedestrian and vehicle movement data to it. We found correlations. What else is supporting this? Well, if we look at the land use record, again, we're in central London. We find 80% of the shops are located on the 20% most accessible streets. So it's no coincidence that we find people where we find people, because they're also being attracted by the shops. But the shops are being attracted by the space. It's that way round, and I challenge you to think about it differently with the case study of trying to open a shop in the middle of a labyrinth. It won't work if it relies on footfall, because no one will find it. You need to put the shops where people naturally find them. So the order is spatial logic, land use logic. Put the footfall dependent uses, or if we're thinking about accessibility by vehicle, put the vehicle accessibility dependent land uses where they can be accessed. I've had trouble in the past persuading planners, but especially architects, that this very, very simple technology could explain a city and how cities work. And the people that I've actually not spent much time with, but who really understand space, are criminals. Criminals understand space far better than architects, is my contention. I'm only going to speak against architects because I am an architect. I'll be polite about all other disciplines. But we don't have a training in people. We don't generally. I didn't until I came across space syntax. Thankfully, things are changing, and more people, as we discussed earlier, are moving in the direction of understanding the importance of Jan Gale and Holly White and Jane Jacobs, Bill Hillier. But criminals really do. And you've been looking at a map here where every white dot is a domestic burglary break-in of a house in an Australian suburb. We used this finding. We were doing this work for the state government, the local government, and the police force, so that they could write new policing guidelines, new planning policies to prevent the creation of the cul-de-sacs and the indirect spatial layouts that made them absent of everyday pedestrian activity and full of crime, and to do the opposite. Now, there's an important point here. The reason that these sorts of streets are absent of pedestrian behavior is because when we observe and follow people, and I might show you Trafalgar Square in a moment, where we followed people, literally followed people, walking behind them at a discrete distance to understand where they went. You typically find in towns and cities that most movement on most streets is just passing through. It's not originated from that street, it's not destined from that street, it's just passing through. And it creates the urban buzz. And we lose it at our peril. So if we design to exclude through movement, we risk the social and economic performance of places. And this is fundamental because there is a view that you should do this. You should avoid strangers, because strangers are dangerous. Strangers kill you, strangers attack you, strangers, and it's a fallacy that police with their evidence are able to support. Strangers are usually beneficial to places. And the more we segregate, enclave, ghetto our cities, the greater risk there is to the social performance of those places. One other area in which these findings are being applied is in real estate and real estate valuation. So here we're looking at a cash flow model for a master planning development in the west of London, where the spatial factor has been input into the lifetime cash model for the development. Its construction cost, its operation cost, maintenance costs. And the difference between the two master plans, the one on the left, which is disconnected, cool, low pedestrian movement, the one on the right, which is connected, if you follow your eye, the streets link up, generates more footfall, generates more everyday life, generates more land value when you look at correlations of other comparable developments in central London. There's 3.3 billion renminbi, in this case, difference between the two master plans. So as architects, as urban planners, as landscape designers, our industries are unknowingly, in many cases, making a huge economic difference to the fortunes of developments, which is why the use case for these research findings or the users of these research findings are often in the real estate industry. So the future, the present and the future of the modeling is to keep building more sophistication into the approach. The future of the theory that underpins it, the theory of natural movement, the theory of through movement, theory of the space as a common language, theory of the movement economy. is that we want to keep adding data sets, keep undertaking studies, whether they're research studies, funded research, PhD programs, master's degrees, or in my case and my colleagues' case, practice projects, to keep testing the models and keep developing the models. And in effect, our commercial clients are paying for the testing of the academic outputs. So we're adding transport data to the models. So at the top right, the street network model, that's what I've been showing you so far. But we're adding data on public transport facilities, private transport facilities. We're adding the land use attraction data to weight models according to the actual location. We have to increasingly do this in modern cities because modern planning has often not followed the rules of historic precedent, and retail has been put not on the main street, but in a shopping mall behind the main street. The natural order of cities has been overtaken by the need to accommodate the motor car, and so the models need to adjust to them. And then at the bottom right there, the urban performance data, where possible, we're bringing in data sets on health, employment, and education inequalities in order to look for the role of the layout of the city in influencing those inequalities. We're not pretending for a minute that the physical and spatial layout of cities determines everything. As you said earlier, policy has a huge determining influence. Operations, management have a huge determining influence. We're interested to say, what's the role of the city itself? And how can we define better ones so that we can address user-focused outcomes? The real pioneers of these methodologies were community groups. The people who were pushing for the application of these tools in the early 1980s, late 1970s were community groups trying to take on large corporations who were proposing developments that the local community felt were unnatural. And people were asking obvious everyday questions. How many jobs can I get to? If I'm looking for a job, how many of them are a reasonable, low-cost public transport commute, or even a walk from where I am? Can I access healthcare that's quality? And can I make a trip to buy food without relying on a car? I want to check in because I've been speaking for a lot. I just want to make sure that I'm making sense, that I'm making points. The closing part of this talk is applications and some ideas for the future. But we've been going about an hour now, I think. We'd allocated 2 hours, but I just wanted, that was what was in my calendar, but I want to make sure.
Did you hear 1 hour?
It's 1 hour. Yeah,
well,
fine. I thought so.
Including Q&A. So I'm just wondering how many more slides.
6,000.
You have to divide that by 1,000.
I'm happy to do that, but also just to stop at this point and take any questions and comments that people have.
That would be a good idea.
Yeah.
So we have 10 minutes for a question and answer. So if anyone in the audience right now, physical audience, want to ask a question, either that or it's just a comment. Yes, it is a question. Is the model able to take into account the impact of other forms of transport, such as buses, trains, and ferries? Well, you can have a go at it. That are only accessible from fixed location. Well, it's a very specific planning question, I guess.
Yeah, yes, is the short answer. And the integrated urban modeling approach that I was just describing in previous slides weights spatial locations according to the availability of other resources. So we can treat a ferry terminal, a bus stop, a rail station as a resource and feed in transportation data if we have access to it on, for example, the annual throughput of that location, in order to then take that down to, say, an hourly movement rate.
Any other questions? Yes.
You mentioned the point about how strangers are beneficial for cities. And you said the more we get our and communities, then the greater the risk to the social performance of space. Do you think that this is the case in Singapore because we are so heavily scrutinized with CCTVs and gated establishments?
Well, that's a very difficult question for a couple of reasons. That I don't know Singapore as well as I'd like to answer the question properly. I think what fascinates me about Singapore are the local centres and the mix that there is, and what I understand the increasing intensification of local centres, the model moving away from deep concentration on the central area to a greater diversity or dissemination of intensity to local centres. I spent the weekend touring some local centres which seem to be mixing retail, street retail, as well as mall retail, as well as living and jobs. That, I think, is very different to the kind of model that I'm worried about. The model I'm worried about is what's happening in the UK, where we're building houses, and that's about it. We're just building houses, and we're not building public transport. So I think in many ways, the UK has a lot to learn. What I can say is that I think the dominance of the road in Singapore is profound. And sorry, that was my alarm to remind me to stop speaking. The dominance of the road I see as being closer to the Corbusier model than I think is. It's difficult for me to sort of come in and say that is right. You know, I don't know what's right, but if I was looking to do something to make a positive change, it would be, I think, the underperformance of main roads in Singapore. And the reason that I would say that is twofold. One, that I think you see people trying to walk along the main road network of Singapore in full sun, pushing small children, because they're the shortest route from A to B. So I'd be looking to upgrade them towards the pedestrian and away from the vehicle. But that doesn't mean pedestrianisation or anything like that. With perhaps one or two exceptions of near pedestrianisation or major pedestrian improvement. And I would look at Orchard, for example, as an example of a road crying out to be a street. The second reason that I think I'd look at roads is that they separate communities on either side of them. And yes, of course, there are bridges and tunnels, and very beautiful bridges and tunnels. Singapore has invested in its connected infrastructure. But when I see people running across the road, not using one or the other, it's a bit like the person pushing the kid in the buggy. They're doing what's instinctively best for them, but is hugely risky. And I think I'd be trying to understand how much of that risk there is here in Singapore. I think it's enough to deserve close attention. I'm trying to be diplomatic.
Question. Thank you for the very interesting talk. I'm just wondering, due to the pandemic, we saw, with the lockdowns, a lot of changes and, more outdoor dining and use of those outdoor spaces. Do you think some of those things are going to be retained, or will we just revert to sort of business as usual?
I think many of them should be retained. Whether they will is, so we've seen in London bike lanes that went in that have been removed, which is a great shame because they were really working well, but they were put in as emergency measures in the short term. We've seen restaurants. Sorry. We've seen restaurants and cafes move their business outside. It was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. There has to be a silver lining, and the coronavirus struck hard in spring, just as it was getting warm in the UK. And so people were able to do this. Had it been 6 months later, maybe it would have said things differently. But we all went outside. And I think a lot of businesses understood the benefit of that. Very typical that street-based businesses think that their customers drive to them. That's very common. I think now they understood people weren't driving because they couldn't drive, they were walking. And I think the nature of work has completely changed to the 3-day week. Monday and Friday are work from home days, certainly in our experience and the experience of lots of colleagues in London. So you manage your business differently. Some meetings are okay online. Some meetings are much, much better face-to-face. And I think the way we behave, the informality of the cat jumping on the desk and everyone actually loving it, or the small child running into the call, and rather than it being thrown out, it's now sat on the lap, and part of the nature of business has become less formal. In many cases, not all, but in many cases, and I think that's really positive. So I think we've been changed. Time will tell. Some people are not going back. I mean, office development in London, the culture of designing an office now, the expectation for open, not just open plan, but the open ground floor, no longer the corporate lobby, the kind of sterile, clinical marble sculpture reception desk, totally gone. That's a waste of space. And so I think that's really positive. And being a bit of an optimist, there's been some good despite so much bad.
There is another question in the chat, which is a question on verticality. What is the most significant impact you foresee with the idea of verticality? While streets at ground level still remain at the main spatial network, is there opportunity to create a multi-level street framework with the built form intensified on the vertical dimension?
Yes, but so yes, and I think Singapore does it, as good as anywhere. I think the ground, below ground to above, -2 to +2 environments in Singapore, and a place like Tokyo, increasingly mainland China, are really, really exciting because you've got the density of tall buildings to create enough activity coming out of the vertical circulation systems to animate those different levels. We find it much harder to do it in Western Europe because we just don't have the density. If you don't have the density in Southeast Asia, don't do it. There's a risk of just the model being copied. But getting people off the ground, getting people to move vertically is not natural. Gravity is natural. Walking up a staircase is not natural. So it's really hard. So I always caution for a simple, single level activity in most places other than these high density centers where you've got a feed from under and a feed from above. And the spatial design of I've talked about streets, but equally staircases, escalators, the location of elevator entrances and shafts. Those are all design elements which need to be taken into consideration. If you can't see the staircase, you can't see the elevator, you don't know how to get up. And I wouldn't say where I was yesterday evening, but it was frustratingly badly laid out. And I think deliberately designed to make me lost. Well, I know this because the retail designers do that, thinking they're lost. They'll never get out. They'll just have to spend their money. That's totally wrong. You're lost. You've switched off shopping. You're never going to spend your money. You want to get out as fast as possible. So that's changing. But the lack of vertical circulation, well-designed vertical circulation, predicates against these multi-level environments.
If I may use, because I'm aware of the time, I might use my chairperson privilege to ask one final question, and that is the design, the modeling that you're talking about. At what spatial scale would it work best? Because a city has multiple moving parts, and if you try to remodel one section, that might have knock-on effects on others. And if you try to do it at a city scale, I'm not sure whether it is even viable to do that. So what works, what scale does it work best? The kind of rescaling and remodeling that you're talking about?
There isn't, I don't think there is a best scale. It depends on your agency. And if your agency is, you're the owner of a building, then you've got to work at the building scale. If your agency is, you're the Prime Minister, you've got a national remit. Or if you're chief planner, if you're for a city or for a country. So all I can speak from is our day-to-day experience, where the activities being undertaken using these models vary from redesigning and designing the interior of buildings to encourage people to interact in the workplace, right up to national and international modeling to understand movement between and across countries. If you're going to make the kind of change away from the way we've been designing to the way we should be designing, I think it's an international effort. It's the international, it's the United Nations, it's the Commonwealths, it's the international bodies in their policy with the Sustainable Development Goals, for example. I mean, they lead us as a practice. We design our business to deliver the SDGs. That can make systemic change. And as a practice, maybe just as a further thought, what we're doing, our agency as a practice is minimal, because we're 28 people in terms of the actual project output that we can deliver, which is why we're not just trying to do that. We're also trying to train and disseminate the software and the methods so that they're available either open and free or through some form of license and subscription.
Okay, I think we can close this seminar today, and thank you everyone online and in presence for being here with us, and thank you, Professor Stonor, for your presentation.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Yeah.